The Russians, and I think probably mistakenly, are licking their chops at Trump's victory. They seem to think they can have their way with Trump in the White House. And I suspect that, again, we can't be certain. There are naive folks around Trump who don't understand how important these issues are. But I think that the Russians will be disappointed. I can tell you, I've been following our policy in Europe, uh, the Russian threat to American interest, Moscow's war in Ukraine, for 10 and a half years very closely. And I remember how unhappy and surprised the Kremlin was when Assad uh, violated the red line that Trump established about using weapons of mass destruction, chemical weapons, on Syrian civilians. And Trump unleashed scores of tomahawks, which took out much of the Syrian Air Force. The Russians duly took note of that, and they were not happy. So they are likely to overplay their hands in any possible negotiation with Ukraine, which would persuade Trump that, yes, they're trying to take him for a fool, and he will not abide that.
It's interesting. You mentioned a few minutes ago that you had reason to be optimistic, and you've just said that you think the Russians might end up being disappointed. I think is what you just said. In the last year, the general discussion around Donald Trump was that a second Trump presidency would end up being very bad for Ukraine through lack of financial support or forcing through negotiations that wouldn't be in Ukraine's interest. I mean, just today, we've had a Ukrainian MP speaking to Times Radio, Alexei Goncharenko, who said that Trump brings, whilst higher risks, greater possibilities. He referred to comments in Trump's speech about his plans to drill, and that if the global oil price dropped as a result of that, that could be devastating for the Russian economy, which is funding the war effort. So do you think Trump's second term has been portrayed in an accurate light in the lead up? Is it as black and white as with regard to Ukraine as everybody seems to have suggested?
I think that there have been two um, deeply opposed parties pushing the line you just described. On the one hand, the Democrats and the mainstream media in the United States, who often work in tandem, have been painting Trump as a monster and claiming that whatever good things happened in his first term was the result of sound advisors whom he will not be choosing in a second term. You've heard that repeatedly from that quarter. And you've heard, you might say, a parallel analysis coming from the loudest supporters of, we might say, MAGA politics. I'm thinking about people like Marjorie Taylor Greene, Matt Gaetz, and others, but not a large number. And of course, there are enablers in the media, Tucker Carlson, right, who claim that, well, Trump didn't really know Washington in his first term, so he relied on Republican insiders. Now that he knows Washington, he's going to be taking true MAGA types. And these are the naive people who have no clue about how dangerous Putin is to the United States. And so together they have presented this view from very different political, ideological angles. But again, if that were true, then you wouldn't expect Mike Pompeo to have clear access to Trump and influence with Trump. You wouldn't expect Robert O'Brien to be a key figure, to have been a key figure on Trump's foreign policy campaign. In the campaign, he was in charge of foreign policy. And we know there are others who are being considered, at least according to media rumors, for cabinet level positions on national security. Tom Cotton, Bill Hagerty, who are sound, understanding the danger of Russia and China and Iran and North Korea working together, and to the detriment of the United States, including in Ukraine.
So is that another way of saying that perhaps there is more to it, this second presidency, than has been portrayed, you think?
Absolutely. Absolutely. So again, we can't be sure how Trump will come down on these issues. But we know that there are people around him who are quite sound. We know that ultimately the aid package passed in April because Trump gave the okay to Speaker Johnson. We know that as that was happening, Trump said that Ukraine's survival is important to the United States. Those are all things on which to build a sound policy. In fact, a sounder policy than we had under Biden. Honcharенko is right regarding Trump has always been good on increasing American oil and gas production, something the Democrats have hindered. We know that Trump is good on Nord Stream 2, while Biden was willing to coddle Schultz and go along with Nord Stream 2 until the big invasion came. And in fact, Biden continues to coddle Schultz because our Nord Stream 2 sanctions end this year. And Schultz asked Biden to block a renewal in the Congress, and Biden's been doing that, much to his shame. That won't happen under Trump. That's a good thing.
One thing that may determine where things go in the future is how the conflict in Ukraine is actually going on the ground. And I thought we could speak briefly about that now, because we understand Ukrainian troops are already in direct conflict with North Korean troops who have moved to support the Russian invasion. What's your assessment of the current state of play in regard to the conflict on the front line?
I think that the situation is more difficult now than it was a few weeks ago. And I think that Ukraine had a hard time starting late last year up through this spring, principally, but not only because of the withholding of American aid. And that meant they had to be very careful with the ammunition and some of the weapon systems that they had. But then starting late spring, early summer, things began to improve along Ukraine's defensive lines in Donbass. And then they launched what has proved to be a quite successful incursion into the Kursk Oblast of Russia. And so I would say from the beginning of that until maybe 2 or 3 weeks ago, things were moving back somewhat in Ukraine's direction. Not just because of what they were doing in Kursk, but because of the impact of that on the front lines. But Russia seems to have now parried, at least partly, the offensive into Kursk and have resumed momentum in Ukraine's east. But they've done that with exceptional casualties, which may or may not be sustainable. I say may or may not because the North Korean factor is a new one. And if this is just the beginning of a pipeline of troops, then even those massive casualties are sustainable for another year or so. So it's a more perilous moment right now. The Ukrainians, though, I believe, are well established in Kursk, despite the current Russian counteroffensive, which is creating some problems on Ukraine's flanks. They're well dug in south of the River Seine. And of course, Putin gave a deadline of October 1st for quote-unquote liberating Kursk. It didn't happen. It's not going to happen this calendar year. I'm safe in projecting. And I believe the Ukrainian line will hold as long as Western assistance is not weakened. And again, we know that there's increasing pressure on Biden to let Ukraine use American ATACMS, the longer range American ATACMS, deeper into Russia. By the way, it's ridiculous that people describe those as deep strike weapons because they go all of 180 miles and Russia's 9,000 miles from east to west. Even if we gave Ukraine Tomahawks, which I believe we should give, with a range of 1,000 plus, that's not quite deep into Russia either, given how large Russia is. But that's somewhat deep into Russia. But the discussion of deep strike ATACMS is simply a sign of how ignorant our discourse is, driven in large part by the timidity of the Biden administration. They've made that connection because they're afraid of giving Ukraine those weapons because they've been intimidated by Russia's nuclear threats.
And the presence of North Korean troops in this conflict has led some to suggest, well, there is no argument rationally, I know sort of dangerous to use the word rational when you're talking about Vladimir Putin, but there's no rational argument as to why NATO troops shouldn't be fighting on behalf of Ukraine in this conflict. What possibility do you think that might be?
I hesitate to raise that subject, NATO troops getting involved. Although the logic you've just laid out is impeccable, because politics ain't logic, and politically that's just an extraordinarily controversial step, and not a necessary step. I don't have any doubt, zero doubt, that if American aid, the amount of American aid continues, but it's continued with far more advanced American weapons, including those Tomahawks, which actually are not advanced. It's 1980s technology like the ATACMS, but they fly farther and have a bigger payload. And we begin to send F-16s in quantity. We train the Ukrainian pilots promptly. Ukraine will begin to push the Russians back on the battlefield. I don't have any doubt about that. The problem is the timidity of the policy to date and the prospect of a far more disastrous American policy if the naive folks around Trump have their way. But assuming, again, if we get a Trump who understands the stakes the way I've laid them out and is not intimidated by the Russians the way Biden has been, things will turn up very nicely.
Zelensky, in the comments I referred to earlier, did present a victory plan to Western leaders, including to Donald Trump and to Joe Biden, a little while ago, which the Times' World Affairs editor Catherine Philp described as receiving a lukewarm response. Why do you think it did receive such a lukewarm response? And if that was the best Ukraine could come up with, why wasn't it backed more fully, do you think?
It received a lukewarm response because of the ultimate timidity of the West in this crisis. And that timidity comes principally from Washington, but enabled by Berlin, because Biden and Schultz have both been intimidated by Putin. His plan is sound because it requires Ukraine to regain a certain amount of initiative on the battlefield, which requires the United States and Germany and others to allow the ATACMS to strike into Russia, to send Tauruses and allow them to be used on Russian territory, and to consider even better weapon systems, even more able weapon systems. And we know that the White House does not want to go there. And that's because they have let Putin deter the United States from behaving like a superpower. And that's deeply unfortunate. The North Korean development is the third development since late last spring to which the United States and NATO have not responded. Moscow is chipping away at NATO's deterrence, one by this large sabotage campaign across Europe, and perhaps heading to the United States if that Wall Street Journal report about the Russians placing explosives on DHL planes, which were heading to the United States and Canada. The US and NATO have not responded to this. Now, over the past 6 or 8 weeks, we've seen regular Russian intrusions into NATO airspace with missiles and drones heading to Ukraine. NATO's not defending its own airspace against Russian provocations, again, chipping away at NATO's deterrence. And now North Koreans, and there's been no response. The White House response is, well, we're not going to put additional restrictions on use of American weapons as a result of this. That's ridiculous. The real response should have been, of course, now we're going to reconsider, and yes, not say a word, but let the Ukrainians use the longer range ATACMS against North Koreans heading to the front in Russia and against other strategic targets in Russia. This is a perfect case of us to begin to have a bolder policy, one that our interests demand.
And so is that the scenario that a personality like Donald Trump could actually have a benefit?
If he decides that Putin's trying to take him for a patsy, for a weak man, that's what we'll see.
Side of this, the domestic side of this, in the sense that Donald Trump, who wanted to be reelected, told the Ukrainian president Vladimir Zelensky in a phone call, "You dish disinformation on Joe Biden." Now, Zelensky refused. Trump then blackmailed Kyiv by cutting off military aid. It was only when that phone call was exposed by a whistleblower and when Trump faced resistance that he allowed the military aid to proceed. Of course, he was subsequently impeached. He was saved from conviction by the Republicans over that incident. That's the background. And Trump doesn't forget grievances, and he doesn't forget those whom he supports and those he dislikes. And what we have had in 2024 in the run up to the election was Trump disparaging Zelensky as a salesman making a pitch to take American money. Every time he comes to us, he walks away with billions of dollars. Now, that's both a pitch that Trump makes and as well as being a parroting of the Russian line that Zelensky exploits people. It's Trump's transactional politics. Trump does not believe in U.S. foreign policy through alliances. He does not believe in working with partners. He believes in it as an individual process in terms of what makes Donald Trump look good.
In that line, though, isn't it true to say that what Donald Trump might say on the campaign trail in rhetoric often translates into something very different in actions?
Except, Kate, that when it comes to what Donald Trump has done in terms of his actions away from the cameras, has genuinely been supportive of the Russian line. He has never come out and challenged the Russian occupation of Crimea. He has never actually come out and challenged the Russian hybrid warfare to split the country. And he has, to bring it up to the current date, said in private what he says in public about Zelensky, that he sees Zelensky as someone who is doing nothing more than to take American money. And Trump has said privately, as well as publicly, of course, I can end this war by supporting peace talks. Now, we need to be very clear, both that public and private presentation of peace talks are not genuine talks in the sense that both sides come to the table and you have a broker, they listen to both sides, you try to find compromise, you try to find room for negotiation. Those peace talks will be on the Kremlin's terms. And the Kremlin's terms will start with a recognition of their annexation of not only Crimea, but of possibly all 4 regions that they claim. Kherson, Zaporizhia in the south, Luhansk and Donetsk in the east. The Russians don't even control parts of those regions, but they will call upon the recognition of full control of those regions, as well as a guarantee that Ukraine cannot become part of a bloc to protect its military security, a guarantee that Ukraine will not be able to go into NATO, and probably a guarantee that Ukraine will not be able to go into the European Union for its economic future.
All of this, though, presumes that Donald Trump can actually force this upon an unwilling President Zelensky.
And that is where the rubber is going to hit the road. Now, the problem for Zelensky is that he's got military forces who are exhausted. They are flat out exhausted. Remember, Ukraine's much smaller than Russia. Ukraine's about 75. Ukraine. Remember, Ukraine's much smaller than Russia. Ukraine is a country of just over 40 million people. You're talking about a Russian population which is 3, even 4 times the size of that. Russia can mobilize far more men than the Ukrainians, especially when Russia's willing to empty its prisons, when it's willing to take elderly men even as part of the fighting forces, when it's willing to take mercenaries, such as the Wagner Group. Ukraine does not have the equipment that Russia has, even with Western assistance. They have a shortage of artillery and artillery shells. So if the U.S. removes its element of the military assistance behind it, that exhausted force faces even greater challenges. And of course, what you have is a real symbol. If U.S. pulls aside to the rest of the international community, well, we're out of here. Because remember, there are those who are Trump supporters or they're aligned with Trump who have tried to block aid, for example, within Europe. Viktor Orban of Hungary, for example. Robert Fico of Slovakia. Now, they'll be bolstered by that position that Trump takes. So I think Ukraine will face a challenge to continue, but I think also, and this is what I'm watching for, I think this will be probably a catalytic moment for Europe, for both the European Union and European members of NATO. Do they stand up to the Trump administration if this is what he does?
And that is the question. Minds will be focused at this meeting of the European political community in Hungary that's taking place. It was launched following Russia's full-scale invasion. President Zelensky is there to appeal to Europe's leaders to stand by Ukraine, notably, obviously, hosted by Kremlin-leading Prime Minister Viktor Orban of Hungary. This presumably is quite an important moment. What do you think can be achieved here?
I think the effort at the European political community will be to try to maintain both publicly and in terms of actual private commitments that support to Ukraine for the moment, to try to prevent Russia from breaking through on the front lines, to possibly give Ukraine additional fighting capabilities, because remember, they still hold territory in Russia. So to help them maintain that, but also to maintain the economic and financial support. I also think there's an open question that should be mentioned here. I'm not sure if it'll come up the European political community, but it's definitely coming up around this because it has for months, which is, will Ukraine finally be allowed to use Western supplied long range missiles to hit Russian targets well inside Russia? Now, Ukraine, using its own capabilities, using drones, for example, has wreaked a significant amount of damage on Russian oil refineries, on Russian supply and logistics positions, and on Russian military bases, naval bases, air bases, army positions. But it could do much more if it was allowed to use the British Storm Shadows and the French Scalp long-range missiles. Washington has refused to allow that so far, even though Britain has indicated it is willing to give that permission. The question here for the Europeans, whether it's at this meeting today or beyond it, is, do they continue to press the case? Because the question for the Biden administration in its last 2 months is, do they finally lift the ban? Because it's far easier, of course, it's a far better position for Ukraine if it goes into January, having had that permission to strike Ukrainian positions, which puts the onus on Trump to try to reimpose the ban.
And interestingly, President Zelensky has been using the presence of North Korean troops in Kursk and the engagement of them with Ukrainian forces as a reason to say, come on, give me those long range permissions, so that and setting out what he says are the bases where those North Koreans are stationed inside Russia, and that this is a moment that the international community really has to make its mind up, get its finger out and say something about this. Could this be a turning point?
So let's recognize that in a way, this is a PR lever, and you understand it's a PR lever for Zelensky, who is trying to get these commitments on long-range missiles on air power to try to shift the balance of the fight in the skies, something that could be instrumental in putting Russia on the defensive. It's a useful lever for him to say, look, this is how far Vladimir Putin is going. He will bring these North Koreans in, recognizing that these troops are from a power which is ostracized by much of the international community, derided by much of the international community, seen as a threat by much of the international community, including because of its nuclear capability. So he's putting that message out to the United States, he's putting it out to the Europeans, he's putting it out to others to say, look, this is why you need to back us. And that is the politics you would expect. But it's also a very real security question here. And it's an inversion of what we were told. The false pretext for Russia to invade Ukraine was that Russia was facing the threat of an invasion from a foreign force, from NATO. And there are a lot of people, whether well-intentioned or otherwise, who parroted that line in the UK, in the US, and other countries. Oh, Russia's fighting a defensive war. Now, here we are in 2024, and no government has authorized forces to fight alongside the Ukrainians. In fact, they've explicitly rejected that. Yet Russia has now taken what we believe to be about 10,000, 11,000 North Korean troops with the prospect of more. So it's actually Russia who has internationalized the front line. So I think that's a pretty good selling point, both in terms of where Ukraine is, but also where Europe is. Because let's realize that in the context of this is not just about Ukraine. Vladimir Putin is someone who carried out a war against another neighbor, Georgia, in 2008. He is something who has carried out cyber war against the Baltic states, notably Estonia, since 2007. He has threatened to carry out war with other NATO members, including Poland, if they don't do the right thing. So it's not just a question of Putin thumping his chest here. he has shown the intention that he will go farther with Ukraine by bringing in foreign forces. Would he go farther if he decided to raise the military stakes with others in Central and Eastern Europe who are members of NATO?
Do you think that the results of the presidential election in the US provides a moment and the prospect of Donald Trump being much more vocal about contribution, how much money individual alliance members of NATO spend on their defense, for example? Do you think this is the wake-up call that Europe really did need to step up its own security and cooperation and defense spending, but also to step up support for Ukraine so that it can continue the war, irrespective of whether the US provides support?
Europe has been preparing for this moment. I would argue this dark moment, not just because of Ukraine, but because of a range of issues. They've been preparing for it for months. And I know that from EU officials of individual countries who have talked about what's been going on behind the scenes. And it would have been negligent not to prepare for a Trump victory because European officials knew it was possible, if not probable. So no, this isn't a wake-up call in terms of Trump winning. If anything, the wake-up call for Europe and the EU as part of that was in February 2022. In that moment when Vladimir Putin launched a full-scale military invasion of Ukraine, he put the marker down, which is, will you not only back Ukraine, but will you organize yourselves? And you know what? This is the answer. Putin lost that. He lost that gamble. Sometimes way too slowly, with a lot of bureaucracy. Those who know the EU know what happens. Europe did rally. Europe did rally in terms of the financial and economic assistance. Europe rallied through NATO, but also through individual countries in stepping up its own defense positioning, whether giving aid to Ukraine or bolstering their own forces. There has been, in the past almost 3 years now, a sign of Europe finding a place that was necessary and vital and trying to fill it. So, in a sense, Vladimir Putin failed. That's part of the reason why Kyiv still stands today. And let's not forget that. But now we face November 2024. Vladimir Putin's possibly last gamble to try to avoid a stalemate and to try to avoid the frustration of his hopes was Donald Trump back in the White House. That it's not a question of European weakness or of Europe not getting its act together. It's that the US no longer will be able to get its act together because of that very chaotic, unpredictable man who happens to be, in effect, and has been for years, subservient to Vladimir Putin.
We hope you're enjoying today's episode of Frontline. Don't forget you can also now listen to Frontline in podcast form. Just search for The World in 10 from wherever you get your podcasts, where you can also hear daily analysis of the biggest stories relating to war and defence. And we'll put a link to The World in 10 in the description below.
Putin is desperate. He has relied on North Korea for thousands, if not millions of rounds of artillery ammunition. He's relied on them for a lot of missile technology. Now, when it comes to manpower, these are 12,000 humans that are being basically put into the meat grinder in Kursk and the Donbass. These are people who are coming from, the warm Far East into a, European winter, into a Russian winter. I mean, you look at the pictures coming out of Kursk and eastern Ukraine today, heavy snow falling. We know that these North Korean soldiers, although some people are saying they're special forces, well, not in any special forces I've come across. We know that they are pretty badly equipped, probably not very well trained. They're being given Russian uniform to wear, which really gets them directly in the sights. And I don't suppose they've had any cold weather training at all. There are already rumours of them handing themselves in at the first opportunity, and they're starting to be killed. So, this to me is an absolutely massive ask. And, Kim Jong-un, whatever he might be, whatever great tyrant he might be, I don't think he would give over so much without so much coming the other way, because, he is of the same, he's the same sort of personality is probably the wrong word of Putin. So, yeah, I mean, that is the ultimate thing to him. And I think also we must not forget the Iranians in all of this. The Iranians have also given a lot of missiles and a lot of drones, a Shahid drone that we're hearing over 300 being fired over the weekend to Moscow. So, what is Iran getting in return? We know, a bit like Kim Jong-un, the mullahs, the ayatollahs in Tehran are desperate for a nuclear capability. And to me, that is the only thing Putin has to offer. Of course, maybe cheap hydrocarbons, but the Iranians don't need those. They've got, bags of it themselves. And North Korea, again, it's not a huge issue for them. So to me, the only thing Kim Jong-un would do this for would be for nuclear know-how. So I think that is the assumption we must make. And that is the assumption that our leaders must make their future decisions on.
You've mentioned there some of the difficulties that Russia and indeed North Korean troops are going to have, whether it be the climate, the communication between the two groups being another, perhaps, that we've had suggestions that already that's proving difficult. If there are so many difficulties in integrating North Korean troops into a Russian offensive, then why do you think the Secretary General of the UN, Antonio Guterres, says that the West should be very concerned about their presence there? Is it a significant boost to Russia, or is it not?
Well, I think it's a significant escalation. I mean, I think very sadly for these North Korean soldiers, because of all the issues you mentioned, command and control, the language, the ability to maneuver with the Russians, doing combined arms maneuver takes a hell of a lot of training. When I was training the 1st Royal Tank Regiment to do this, we trained for over 18 months before we went to operations. These people are having days, if not hours. So to me, that means that literally all they can do is march forward into the guns. But I think it's significant. I mean, 15,000 soldiers is a lot of soldiers. And people are making such a thing about it. I think it's important because to me it is showing that sort of Putin is running out of road, as it were, and that is key. It's key that for the West, because we're going to talk about what's happening in the US this week very soon. But in a way, I'm sure Zelensky and the Ukrainians feel that their road is running out, and the important thing to me is who hangs on longest here. And Putin is doing all he can because, there is a circumstance potentially, if we're still in this position in 6 months' time, NATO and the US may not be as supportive as they have been hitherto. And then Ukraine has to go to the negotiation table in a really poor position. Conversely, if the West absolutely gets behind Ukraine, and for instance, I mean, the Americans have said fairly quietly, but in the open, that those North Korean soldiers can be targeted with US weaponry, in other words, long-range ATACMS, guided missiles. Now, this is new. So this is something I've been shouting at the British government for the last 6 months, that they should allow Ukrainians to attack Russian forces in Russia using the British Storm Shadow missile. Now, if the Americans are now, taking the shackles off Ukraine a bit, that is hugely significant. But it might well be if President Trump wins the election this week or next week, whenever the results are shown, then that might be rescinded. So there is an awful lot of play for. That's why I think this is so hugely significant. It's more significant in a sort of geopolitical, strategic, military perspective than perhaps tactically on the ground. Because I think tactically on the ground, these North Koreans are going to march towards the Ukrainian trenches and Ukrainian forces and probably get killed even more quickly than their, I say, Russian comrades in inverted commas. So, but from a geopolitical piece, it's much more important, significant, because it brings in, somebody to the battlefield. It maybe NATO is thinking about putting some of its own boots on the ground, as it were, in Ukraine. And this would really give them, not carte blanche, but a reason to do it. So, yeah, strategically, I think it's hugely significant. Tactically, on the ground, sadly, I think it's pretty grim for those North Korean soldiers who are going to be marching in the mud westwards pretty soon.
And in terms of where they are marching, I mean, we're led to believe, am I right, the majority of them, if not all of them, are in the Kursk region. So is there any significance to the fact that they are within Russian territory?
Well, I don't think so. Not from a sort of military perspective. We know that the Russians are desperately trying to regain that Kursk salient, which Ukraine took, and the Russians have regained quite a lot of land, but actually holding it is the challenge. And I expect that's where the North Koreans will come in. They will regain some land, dig trenches, and stick them in there, and hope that they can hold it. But it's no different from being Kursk is Ukrainian held Russian land, as Crimea is Russian held Ukrainian land. So the Russians might try and sell it that way, and of course their disinformation and propaganda is on a scale that we find very difficult to counter. So that is certainly their reason. They're taking back, Mother Russia's sovereign territory. But in the same way, Ukraine is trying to take back its own territory in the Donbass and Crimea.
We happen to be speaking as America votes on who is going to be the next US president. A lot has been made. I mean, we're not going to go over old ground, but a lot has been made about what Donald Trump has said about the Ukraine conflict and how he would solve it and how quickly he would solve it, et cetera, et cetera. But from what you know of the war, in your mind, what are your fears or maybe your main fear or your main hope as you and I have this conversation of what could happen in the next few months?
Well, I think I'd say I'm no great expert on US politics, and I've listened to what both sides have said and what Trump said, and a lot of what he says is for his own public consumption rather than perhaps elsewhere. I'm having worked in this space, on both sides of the fence, as it were. I'm pretty confident that actually underneath the political level, the military people, the security services, are cracking on and doing their job. I don't think, a bit like this country, whatever Keir Starmer and his team think, actually, what is going on at the sort of tactical and operational level, militarily, and from security service perspective, it isn't going to change. And I think hopefully that is not going to be a if Trump is the next president, I don't think he will not have that impact that perhaps some people think he might have the day afterwards. And his view that he can solve this war in a day, well, maybe he thinks he can go to the Kremlin and tell Putin to withdraw his forces, and then there can be a peace. If he did that and Putin did that, yeah, sure, he could end the war. But I don't think anybody who looks at this very closely thinks that Putin is just going to withdraw all of his forces from Ukraine because Trump says so. Conversely, I don't think Trump going into Kyiv and telling President Zelensky to sue for peace on current lines is going to get much truck either. What would be devastating, of course, but I don't think it's going to happen overnight, is if the US withdraws support, and US is overwhelmingly the major contributor to everything for Ukraine. I think in the short term, it's part of the bluff and bluster of these sort of level of politics. If we are still speaking of this in the same manner in 12 months' time, then sure, Trump will have a very significant role to play if he is president. But I think all of us who are deeply involved in this just want, and I'm sure everybody in the world wants this war over as quickly as possible, to with a position that the Ukrainians are happy with, and the rest of Europe is happy with. Because the final thing I'd say here, if Putin is in Ukraine this time next year, perhaps in Kyiv, game's over. That to me is that is war in Europe, because nobody thinks, especially anybody in the Baltic states, that he will stop in Kyiv. And I hope that Sir Keir Starmer and whoever is the new leader of the states absolutely gets this, because nobody, I think, wants another war in Europe.
At the moment, Russia seems to be willing to tolerate the cost of the war in terms of casualty as on the battlefield, and also the financial cost of the country back home. Do you agree with the analysts who say Russia cannot sustain the war effort at this current level beyond 2025? And if so, how would you prepare for that moment and prevent a disingenuous ceasefire offering at that point?
So the first thing is that Russia's historically shown an incredibly high tolerance for pain and cost. The estimates of how much of their economy is now supporting the war effort or one form or another have skyrocketed. It's a significant percentage. People are talking over 30% now. The arrival of North Korean troops, I think, is a useful boon, but not vital, although they do want to reduce the pressure on their need for further mobilisation. What we do see is that in material terms, that the weapons of war, equipment, all of those sorts of things, they have been overwhelmingly refurbishing equipment up until now. And the rough estimate from our researchers and others is that by the time we get deep into 2025, summer and later in the year, they will be pretty close to expending all of their old supplies of tanks, of artillery barrels, of other things, armoured vehicles. And at some point then, they've got to start making new artillery barrels, which are complicated, and new armoured vehicles, and all of these other things. And that creates a potential vulnerability in two cases. First of all, they've got to keep up production at a pretty high rate to replace losses. Otherwise, their battlefield availability just drops. The second thing is it's another area where effective enforcement of sanctions could really hurt. And we've just released a research project with some partners, which pointed out there are still elements of the artillery chain, the propellant, the materials that go into making barrels, that could be sanctioned, or rather, there are sanctions in place, but they're not being effectively enforced, that could really cut the supply ending up on the front line. And when you combine that with Ukrainian deep strikes with their own drones, which are hitting ammunition storage, they could begin to hit a crunch. The problem is the current trend is such that there's a danger that Russia begins to make much more accelerated advances before they hit that crunch point.
Today, the UK has announced 56 new sanctions aimed at disrupting the supply of equipment for Putin's war machine. It's become the first country also to directly sanction the Russian-backed Africa Corps. It was timed to coincide with this meeting of the European political community set up in the wake of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine taking place in Hungary. President Zelensky is there. What else can he get from this, and how effective? I mean, these sanctions, these 56. Whenever I hear this, I kind of think, why didn't it happen before? What can you tell us about the timing of this, and what more President Zelensky can get from it?
So the sanctions. I mean, the timing is obviously important in terms of showing continued political support from European partners for Ukraine. There's I'm occasionally a bit of a skeptic on what sanctions can achieve overall. They are not good at, on their own, forcing a country to back down. And that's because countries tend to develop evasion techniques and routes. But targeted sanctions can identify elements of a system, finance or material, that you can begin to pick apart and actually increase the pressure on a particular component. So I wouldn't say these sanctions will really bring an end to Russia's war, even though they're sort of targeting the war machine. But those that really pick at specific elements of the system, and I haven't looked through the latest list, can, if they're combined with enforcement activity, make a material impact. But a lot of this is fundamentally political signalling. I mean, I think the problem is that the mood music that's coming out of Kyiv at the moment is that thank you very much for the political signalling, but what I need is artillery, air defences, long-term financial support, and a change in permissions or a changed position on escalation rather than nice words.
And when you said earlier on, when we first started talking about the future and talking about what potential influence President Trump will have on this situation, you talked about the implications for Ukraine if the US withdraws its support and tries to force upon it this kind of these frozen lines, as it were. I mean, that is pretty unthinkable for President Zelensky, not least so because of the occupied territories and what would happen to the people, the Ukrainians who are there right now, who are suffering terribly. Can you just explain how it would actually play out exactly in theory? I mean, I know it's nothing that's actually been agreed at all, but what is the thinking on that?
Well, I mean, I think the problem is it's difficult to see how that would play out in both practical and political terms. I mean, politically, it's near unthinkable for the Ukrainians to accept that. So the Russians, at the moment, would either want to join up if you like, the four oblasts where they dominate. So Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson. That includes holding Crimea. That would be an enormous chunk of Ukraine gone. That would be essentially rewarding the Russians for the invasion. Even freezing the line where it is and having some kind of demilitarized zone would put things in a very unfavorable position for the Ukrainians. Let's say they evened up the territory in the north. So they gave back the territory in Kursk, and that was swapped for the Russian lodgement just north of Kharkiv, maybe a couple of other places. That leaves them with a very awkward front line. They would argue it leaves them not well placed in the face of future Russian aggression. There would need to be some kind of security guarantee. And how would you enforce that? Would you be basing international forces in Ukraine as a tripwire? And fundamentally, it means saying goodbye to a massive chunk of the country and a population where the evidence that's come up so far, quite apart from fundamentally war crimes being committed by Russian troops, but the erasure of Ukrainian culture and society, changes in language use. There are obviously some parts of the country where Russian has been popular for a long time, but the Russians have extended that area. They have obviously had this kidnapping campaign to take children out into Russia proper, and they have been raising sites of significance to the Ukrainians. Like it would be wholly unacceptable. It would be difficult to see Zelensky or a future Ukrainian government agreeing to that. That could only come if there was the fear of future and imminent pressure that would take even more territory. I mean, it really would be a pretty dire situation for the Ukrainians if they were accepting any of those terms.
Let's turn to NATO now, and what you think Donald Trump as president would do. What would his impact be on NATO? Would he make it stronger or weaker?
We have the trouble of parsing the difference between what Trump says and what he means. And that's not just a line that his defenders have used. It reflects the reality of not everything that he said in his first term was actually implemented. In fact, the majority of it wasn't. So John Bolton, for example, his former national security advisor, says he thinks Trump will try and pull the US out of NATO. There's a question of what that actually means, because there is no exit mechanism in NATO, but he could do the equivalent of quiet quitting if all the American officers were withdrawn from their posts, or they pulled out of the command structure and basically didn't turn up for work. Or is it a rhetorical flourish to get other people to increase their defence spending, which Trump can then claim credit for? And that would be quite similar to what happened in his first term, which is that there was already a 2% spending target. Countries were already increasing their spending. But I think it's pretty clear that Trump's diplomacy, if you want to call it that, really encouraged people to up that, or at least make a show of upping that, even more so, in spite of the fact that they had started doing it. So one of the questions is, maybe he's just trying to get a strong NATO because that is in America's interests, because that then actually enables him to say, look, Europe is better defended because I made the Europeans spend more money. Now I can move US forces off to the Indo-Pacific and we can deal with the challenge of China. The big problem is that the uncertainty that his partners say is part of his foreign policy is harmful to some of what NATO does and how it operates, which is the question of, would the US defend Europe in the event of a Russian attack on a NATO member?
And indeed, and during the campaign trail, but during the campaign trail, well, he said things like that President Putin could do whatever the hell he likes, inverted commas, to a country, an alliance member that's not paying its 2% of GDP towards defence. That in itself, I mean, I don't know what President Putin would make of that comment at all, or take it at his word. And I don't suppose any of us know whether what he says is what he means anyway.
US complaints about European defence spending are as old as NATO itself. So it is entirely fair to say there have been complaints going back years, including various American officials and presidents, if you like, appearing to cast doubt on Article 5. The thing is that in the majority of cases, it is because of the level of US involvement in entanglement, it has generally been assumed that they would. Again, Trump defenders would say, well, but actually the number of US forces in Europe slightly increased during his first administration, which is true. The problem is, I think a lot of people are confusing uncertainty with ambiguity. That sounds like dancing on the head of a pin, but what I really mean is that in deterrence, you create your red line or your conditions where consequences will be triggered. And then what you want potentially is a bit of ambiguity beneath that, so that not only does your adversary not cross that line, but they don't go too near it. The problem is that Trump's rhetoric and the way that he's specifically talked about defending Europe has not just created ambiguity, but actually uncertainty as to whether he would do so in the case the red line was crossed. And that is the problem for Europe.
And Donald Trump often been described as a disruptor. You could say that he has that in common with President Putin, President Xi, Kim Jong-un, Benjamin Netanyahu. In today's world, what is the risk of that, instead of ending wars, more likely to provoke the next one?
I think his supporters are the claim made often is no wars in his first term. And I think the problem with that is that people in Raqqa or Syria or Crimea or most of Ukraine would rightly point out that wars were still waged and people still died. Of course, what they really mean is no new wars. There were no new ones started. I would say we had a near miss with the Iranians, a very mixed US policy on Iran. Things weren't exactly successful with North Korea. It is true that kind of madman factor, as it's sometimes called, it's not, I don't mean pejoratively about Trump, but the idea that unpredictability creates uncertainty in your adversary and therefore they're more wary, assumes that they don't think the interests are more in their favour. And so bluntly, they take risks. We've seen the Iranians take risks. Iranians were prepared to attack US personnel while Trump was in office, even after Soleimani was killed. That's the head of the Quds Force. So I don't think there are any guarantees. And there's a degree to which he's sold the pass by making such a great play of no new wars being started, that you might see someone like North Korea or Iran or Russia ask themselves, well, if I just do a small act, will he really start a new war over this small act? And so I think the problem is that the peace through strength argument needs to reckon with decision-making by people who are more prepared to take risks.
You've been watching Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Chabot. My thanks to our producers today, Louis Sykes and Morgan Burdick, and for you for watching. If you'd like to support us, you can subscribe now, or you can listen to Times Radio for the latest news and in-depth analysis, or go to thetimes.co.uk. For now, though, thanks for watching. Bye-bye.